sponsors and awardees of the Asia CEO Forum, the Honorable Commissioner Ruiz, members of the business community, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, after listening to our three distinguished speakers, I'm sure you'll agree with me that you don't need a prophet of boom to be optimistic about the future of the Philippine economy, both near-term and long-term. In fact, I sent Richard a PowerPoint presentation of more than 30 slides, which I'm sure you will agree we will not have to cover. You know, economists can even be worse than politicians. You give them the mic and they can speak for hours and hours. Now, I'm not going to use the PowerPoint presentation, but I give Richard and Rebecca the freedom to send them to you who would want to see the data supporting the statements that I will be making. As an economist, I'm very conscious of the fact that we should not expect audiences like you to take our word without looking at evidence, data, especially coming from very independent think tanks from all over the world. And that is what my PowerPoint presentation contains. Tables, charts, and all sorts of information coming from Goldman Sachs, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, the Oxford Economics Institute, the Japan Credit Rating Agency, name it. Institutions completely independent of the Philippine government. I made it a point not to cite any data coming from us, whether public or private, so they're not suspected as self-serving. And you will see in this data that for more than 10 years now, we have lost our reputation, happily, as the sick man of Asia. If any one of you is still with the inferiority complex that the Philippines is the sick man of Asia, please get rid of it. For more than 10 years now, we have been cited as one of the most promising emerging markets, not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but in the rest of the world. Now, let me cite the most recent comparative data coming from the World Bank. In fact, it was already cited by Speaker Romualdez. And this was before the 7.6 growth in the third quarter that surprised everyone, including an optimist like me. I never expected that in the third quarter, with all the natural calamities, and still the hesitation to transition to a post-pandemic scenario, that we would get 7.6%. I'm sure you know that the dragon of Asia, China, is growing only at 3 to 4%. And so it was really an astounding accomplishment. Together, of course, to be more or less unbiased, together with Vietnam. Right now, it's Vietnam and the Philippines that are neck to neck in terms of GDP growth. And to be honest, I think Vietnam will surpass us for the whole year. And the reason is because Vietnam, over the last 10 to 15 years, part of that time we were still a segment of Asia, had been focusing on countryside and agricultural development, and has been completely open to foreign direct investments, while we were still talking about Filipino first. Foreigners can own only 40% of any investment in strategic infrastructures and so on and so forth. You know exactly what I mean. One of the legacies that Duterte will be remembered for is the amendment of the Public Service Act. So that's the first thing I would like to cite as a reason for being very optimistic about attracting foreign investments in the next 5 to 6 years. And I'm so glad to see President Marcos Jr. traveling all over the world, telling people, please come and invest. I don't mind if he sees as many car races as he wants to, as long as he's constantly networking with people. In fact, I was amused that even in Cambodia and Myanmar, which economies are still way behind us, he was telling people, please come to the Philippines to invest. You can see the effort he's exerting. Why do I refer to this very important portion of the economy? Because I guarantee that in the next 5 to 6 years, even if the Philippine economy goes into autopilot, 6 to 7% GDP growth rate is already sure. And in fact, even if those who are still thinking, with whom I disagree, who are still thinking that we elected the wrong president, even if they're right, 6 to 7% is going to be delivered by the inherent strengths, institutions, and human resources that we already have. Between 2011 and 2019, and you'll see this in the PowerPoint presentation. I'm sure you remember 2011, 2019. Why do I refer to the decade? Because that is the decade when we were no longer considered the sick man of Asia. If you remember that period, half of that was still Noy. 2011 to 2016. 2016, 2019, just before the pandemic, was Duterte. I'm sure you will agree with me that the two presidents couldn't be more different in all types of personal qualities. I will not elaborate. However, despite very varying forms of personal and public leadership, year in and year out, from 2011 to 2019, the economy grew at 6 to 7%. Conclusion, to a certain extent, we can make the occupant of Malacanang irrelevant. As long as they do what our presidents have been doing for the last 30 years, always appointing to the key positions that have to do with the economy the best and the brightest. And you have seen a demonstration, without meaning to flatter, two of them today in the cabinet of President Marcos Jr. And let me also say, it's not only the executive. Our first speaker is a demonstration that we also have some of the best and the brightest in legislators. Let me just remind you, if some of you are still doubtful about this statement, that we always have had the best and the brightest, no matter what the quality of our president was. Who was our worst president? I can say this on evidence that he was impeached after 2 years of being president. I'm sure you know whom I'm referring to. Under him, who were members? Diokno. Now being praised to high heavens. In fact, as you know, during the term of Duterte, he was voted by an international organization as the best government governor in the world, not only in the Asia Pacific. And since at least people like Joey Quisha and company, whom you very well know, almost year in and year out, our governors, whether it was Tetanco, whether it was Buenaventura, and so on and so forth, were always considered among the best governors in Southeast Asia. So I cite those data to just illustrate that that is not whistling in the dark. That is based on facts. And why do I refer to this very important historical evidence? Because over 30 years, because we have had the best and the brightest leading the economic agencies, slowly but surely, I will use Cebuano because Secretary Frasco used Cebuano, hinay-hinay pero kadunay. I'm sure the Cebuanos here know exactly what I'm saying. We were building stronger institutions, correcting economic errors, especially as regards an inward-looking, protectionist, anti-market policies that lasted for too long, which unfortunately had been enshrined in the Philippine Constitution. As you very well know, there are still restrictions. in the Philippine Constitution that were not remedied by the amendment of the Public Service Act. No foreigner can own even 1% in media, according to our Constitution. No foreigner can own land, according to our Constitution. And it's going to take a lot of effort to change that. But precisely, I thought that the people under Duterte was very clever in being able to address part of the problem, investing in airports, investing in telecoms, investing in subways, investing in so many strategic infrastructures by just redefining what a public utility is. And that is why they're no longer public utilities, they are public services, and you can have 100% foreign investor from Spain. For example, Spain, in the form of Acciona, one of the largest infrastructure companies in Spain that own and operate airports in the US, in Germany, in many developed countries, is very interested in looking at some of our airports to own and operate them. I'm so glad that I was able to confirm all the bright prospects that were described by Secretary Frasco. Just by coincidence, in the last 10 days, I had to travel to Boracay to give a briefing to the Association of IT BPM sector, and I'm sure many of you belong to that sector. Incidentally, I was so pleased to hear them so bullish about their sector. They will add 1 million more people to their sector between now and 2028. And they will bring their foreign exchange earnings from about $31 billion today to more than $50 billion by 2028. And I saw their assumptions as very realistic. In fact, there are 3 engines of growth that make me very confident about the 6 to 7% growth I have forecasted. Number 1 would be the 10 million or more overseas workers. We have sending $36 billion of remittances to the relatives. Multiply that by 57, 58. My forecast, don't believe in those who say the peso will be a senior citizen. No way. It will not reach 60. As I watch Governor Medalla and company aggressively increasing interest rates, and if there's one thing the central bank has perfected, it is the art of inflation targeting. By the end of the year, they will bring back the exchange rate to between 57 to 58, which still is very good for the overseas workers' relatives. In fact, I thought it was unjust for us to keep that exchange rate below 50 for too long. These 10 million workers are sweating it out, and they're rewarding them with a strong peso. That's not the way to manage the foreign exchange sector. I think 57, 58 is a good balance between these relatives and overseas workers getting what they deserve and our controlling inflation so that imported articles which are necessary will not be too expensive. So as you know, managing the macroeconomy is always a balancing act. And I think 57 to 58 is the right foreign exchange rate given market forces. Second engine of growth, I already mentioned it, and I'm sure many of you belong to it, BPO IT sector. Gradually transitioning from voice-oriented customer relations industries, which are the easiest to robotize, which are the easiest to replace by artificial intelligence. And that is why I was so glad to hear from that conference in Boracay the 3 words: reskilling, upskilling, and retooling workers. Incidentally, that's my advice to all of you top executives. Focus in the next 3 to 5 years on upskilling, reskilling, and retooling your workforce. Forget MBAs, forget Bachelor of Science. In fact, I was so pleased to hear one of the top executives of the BPO sector, this time in Puerto Princesa, As I said, I was in Boracay, but I was in Puerto Princesa up to about 3 days ago. So I was there before Vice President Harris. It was a conference with the Palawan Business Club, and one of the speakers, I'm sure you know her, Heidi Enriquez, who was the one who established CITEL in Puerto Princesa. I was amused when she was just illustrating the point that we should forget BS, AB, etc., because she said most of the time all these BS courses are BS. And I agree. We have overemphasized college diplomas, college degrees, and so on and so forth. Secretary of Trade and Industry Fred Pascual has been shouting to the four winds, forget degrees. Focus on competencies and skills, no matter how you get them. And that is definitely a very good advice to all of you. Don't look at whether or not an applicant has a college degree. Ask, what skills do you have? What competency do you have? What experience do you have? In fact, I was so glad to hear an entrepreneur who is making a lot of money in animation. As you know, Filipinos are some of the best drawers. We are supplying Japan for their anime industry. He was so proud when he said, none of my 100 workers has a college degree. And I think that was a very good signal to a lot of employers. So you have the first two, overseas workers and BPO IT. The third is exactly what we heard from Secretary Frasco. Tourism accounts for 12% of Philippine GDP, starting with domestic tourism. In fact, I'm sure you know that even at the height of the pandemic, some people were just so uncomfortable staying home that we already saw an uptick in domestic tourism. Let me just remind you that just going from Manila to Fuenteventura to Matabungkay to the Cebu is domestic tourism. And that was, in fact, a lot of people were living in those areas. They were domestic tourists because they had their homes in the Marinas, in Forbes Park, and so on and so forth. And many of you, I'm sure, even without living in these plush subdivisions, spent a lot of time in the beaches. Do you know that before the pandemic, 60 million Filipinos were traveling out of their home to another destination in the Philippines? These are by right called domestic tourists. And I tell you, in those two trips I made to Boracay and Puerto Princesa, I can really vouch for the phrases revenge traveling and revenge spending. And as Speaker Romualdez mentioned, if in the third quarter we already attained 7.6%, in the fourth quarter, the growth rate will be closer to 8%. Because what period of the year do people spend a lot, celebrate a lot, travel a lot? And we don't even to count on the foreigners coming back, or even in the overseas workers visiting their families. Just Filipinos who are already here, you can be sure. From November to December, even to part of January, you will have a lot of consumption-oriented growth in GDP. So, my first forecast for 2022, our GDP average will be more than 7.7%. Why do I say that? Because already, up to now, the 3 quarters, you add all the growth rates in 3 quarters, the average is already 7.7%. So 8% is very doable for the whole year, and we might still beat Vietnam. I don't know what the Vietnamese are saying, but we may still beat Vietnam for 2022. But as you go towards the next 3 to 5 years, Vietnam has stronger institutions and policies that will make them lead growth in Southeast Asia. Now, let me talk about the upside. What is the upside? The Philippine economy under President Marcos Jr. may see an 8 to 10% growth in GDP if we're able to focus on just three strategic directions. One, and that's why I'm glad he's the Secretary of Agriculture, if he can deliver a growth of the agriculture sector of just 2 to 3% every year for the next 4 to 5 years, that will be one contribution to an acceleration of our growth to 8 to 10%. Why do I say 2 to 3%? Because if you study the whole of Southeast Asia, even the agricultural dynamos like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, only grow their agriculture at 2 to 3% every year. It's very difficult to grow agriculture faster than 2 to 3%. So that's my first assignment, quote unquote, to President Marcos Jr. And what is the good news? The good news is in his first quarter as president, we already attained, as was mentioned by Speaker Romualdez, 2.2%. For those of you who have been following agriculture, over the last 5 years, there were at least 6 quarters in which GDP attributed to agriculture actually had -1, -0.5, or even 0. But in the first quarter of the presidency of Bongbong Marcos Jr., agriculture grew at 2.2%. So he started on the right foot. First requirement. Second requirement, and that's why I said I'm so glad that he is really all over the world getting foreigners to come here. We have to increase the rate of our investment to GDP from the low of 20 to 22% to the average of East Asia, which is between the 30 to 40%. Singapore obviously has 40% of its GDP in investment. We have been traditionally investing 20 to 20% of our GDP. Now, I'm sure you will agree with me that in the next 3 years at least, our local investors, no matter how many Ramon Angs you have, no matter how many Ricky Razons you have, no matter how many Pangilinan you have, will not be able to fill the vacuum that the government will have because the government is buried in debt. And the build program of President Duterte cannot be sustained by government spending alone. The government, as you were told by Speaker Romualdez, has to bring down our debt-to-GDP ratio to less than 60%, and hopefully by the end of the Marcos administration, Marcos Jr. administration, we will be back to 30%, which is what the rate was before the pandemic. That will take a lot of work of Commissioner Ruiz and company to make sure our revenues go up. And the only way we can continue build is precisely to get foreigners to build our airports, our subways, our trains, name it. And that, incidentally, is also what we have to do, graduating from just farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems, bridges, and so on and so forth, which were mostly the components of the build program of President Duterte. Incidentally, let me just make a side remark. I was in a private sector board of advisor to Mark Villar as Secretary of Public Works and Highways. And just apropos something that you read about a debate going on in the Senate, I can attest to the fact that the Duterte administration spent more than 90% of the budget for public works in the countryside, in farm-to-market roads. And their philosophy was, and I saw that at close range, precisely because we met as private sector representatives with Mark Villar. Their philosophy was, if Manila wants better skyways, Cebu wants better airports, etc., let Manny Pangilinan, let Ricky Razon, let Ramon Ang, let Mega Wide do it. What we will do is use government funds on agricultural and countryside development. So I think it was unfair for one of the senators to hint that they were spending money in the urban areas. That was not true. Just for subdivisions and so on and so forth. I can speak independently because I was there as a private sector representative, really making sure that the last administration of the Department of Public Works was doing the right thing. And for those of you who have heard me for many decades, I was like a broken record. Farm to market roads, irrigation systems, post-harvest facilities. And it was only during the Duterte administration that I saw a tremendous improvement there, because I'm sure those of you who have followed our government budget, for years we spent only 2% of GDP on infrastructure. Duterte raised it to 5 to 6%. One last homework for President Marcos Jr., for us to accelerate growth to 8 to 10%. Make a significant improvement in fighting corruption, attaining good governance. And again, I'm so glad to hear Commissioner Ruiz describe, and this is not to flatter him, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. He showed us record increases in customs collection over the last 2 to 3 years. I partly attribute that to a very sound partnership that the Bureau of Customs had with a private NGO called the Institute for Governance, Corporate Governance, whose last president was Secretary Fred Pascual. That institute partnered with a number of government agencies to improve the culture of integrity and honesty. And as you know, the Bureau of Customs had been very notorious as one of the most corrupt agencies in the past. Well, see, I don't expect you to just believe the words of the people working with the Bureau of Customs. They showed it by actually showing those tremendous increases in their collections. So that's an example. If we are able to do that in as many of the government agencies, including the Department of Education. You may not think of that as a place where you have to focus, but I know for a fact that Sara Duterte, that is his main concern now. To be able to make sure that textbooks, teaching materials, all those hanky-panky that we used to hear about the Department of Education will not happen under her watch. And do you know his number one advisor, just to show you that it is a realistic goal, is the feisty security advisor of President Marcos Jr. Those of you from UV know exactly whom I'm referring to. Clarita Carlos. If you meet her, you know what I mean. No nonsense lady. And to have her as the advisor of Sara Duterte to fight corruption is very assuring. So, in summary, agriculture, 2 to 3%. Investment to GDP ratio, at least 30 to 32%, mostly coming from foreign direct investments. And finally, a significant improvement in the integrity of our government agencies. If we're able to do those things, 8 to 10%, which will accelerate our becoming a first world economy even before 2040. I chose 2040 because that was what NEDA said during the Duterte administration in their document called Ambisyon Natin 2040. So their target was to make us first world. Just to be safe, I say the decade of 2040 to 2050. So anytime during that decade. But if our growth rate becomes 8 to 10%, it can even be before 2040. How do we become first world? Speaker Romualdez already mentioned that under President Marcos Jr., we will transition from a low middle income economy to an upper middle income economy. And what is the threshold? $4,000 per capita. That's the World Bank requirement. So between now and probably 2025, we will cross the threshold. $4,000 per capita. Now, $4,000 per capita should transition to more than $12,000 per capita if we want to be considered high income or first world. And that will happen. Those of you who know compounded growth rate, you can use your calculator. If we grow at 6 to 7%, and even more at 8 to 10% in the next 20 years, we will transition from $4,000 to $12,000 easily. And so I always tell people who graduate from our university, they are mostly centennials and millennials. They are so fortunate because they will see exactly the opposite of what we senior citizens saw. You know what I mean. The baby boomers, Generation X, in the 1950s and 1960s, we were told by international economists, the Philippines is going to be, together with Burma, think of how economists can be wrong, the ones that will follow Japan first in Asia to be a first world economy. They were very wrong. Because we saw ourselves from one of the most promising economies in Asia to become the sick man of Asia. And the explanation is not corruption. South Korea is still very corrupt. And South Korea is first world. I'm not saying this to justify corruption. I'm just saying that the main reason for economic backwardness is stupid economic policy. Wrong priorities. No agriculture, no rural development, inward-looking, import substitution, protectionist. These were what brought us down. Of course, we also have to fight corruption. When I fight corruption, it's not because of economic reasons. We have to fight corruption because it is immoral, period. Whether or not it leads to economic development. And so, this is the short term and the long term of the Philippines. Those of you who are below 50, if you take care of your health, you will see the Philippines as a first world economy. You know, I mentioned Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. It was the first to make a forecast all the way up to 2050. And those of you who saw it, it will be in my PowerPoint. In the forecast of Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in 2050, the Philippines will be the 16th largest economy in the world, surpassing Indonesia, Australia, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and so on and so forth. When I presented that forecast to audiences like you, I usually get responses like, Dr. Villegas, please, don't tell us about 2050. We will not be there to see it. Do you know what I tell them? Speak for yourselves. My mother lived up to 102. So I may be there with some of you to see 2050. Thank you very much.